Hello everybody, Simon Marvel here from Acuity. Welcome to this webinar, 7 Steps to Building a Risk-Based Approach to Cybersecurity. I'm your host, founder and CEO of Acuity Risk Management, having previously been a risk management consultant. I'd like to make this session interactive if possible, so please post any questions in the chat box and I'll leave time to answer these at the end. You can contact me directly by email or connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like to, and we'll share the slides and the recording. So you'll have my details if you want to reach out at a later date. This webinar is actually the first in a series of 3. So in a couple of weeks' time, we'll have a webinar on quantifying your cyber risk, measuring what matters. That's on May the 19th. And then 2 weeks after that, on June the 2nd, we'll be talking about risk and the board. Convincing the board of your cybersecurity approach is the most important thing you do. For today, though, we're talking about 7 steps to a risk-based approach. We see a lot written about risk-based approaches to cybersecurity, and these mean different things to different people. So we'll be talking about why it's important, what it is, and I'll be introducing the 7 steps. Just some context before we start. In 2019, the World Economic Forum identified cyber attacks as the #1 risk to doing business in the USA and Western Europe, followed by data fraud and theft. Clearly, since then, the COVID-19 crisis has escalated, and that just shows the uncertainty around risk and how sometimes completely unanticipated events can quickly evolve, and sometimes referred to as black swans. There's evidence that the cyber risk is increasing through the pandemic, and even so, there's no doubt that cyber remains a major risk to business, and who's to say that the next black swan event won't be a global disruption from a virus of a digital kind rather than medical. Against that, we're seeing ever increasing growth in the rate of spending on cybersecurity products and services. So Gartner identified 8.4% increase in 2019 to 124 billion, and are forecasting $170 billion by 2022. And there's no doubt that after years of significant and growing expenditure on cybersecurity, business leaders are now demanding that cybersecurity programs prove their value. The Ponemon Institute are estimating global value at risk of $5.2 trillion over the period up to 2023. And in addition, regulators are challenging levels of enterprise resilience within businesses. Almost everyone agrees that cyber risk is serious and in need of constant attention. And at the moment, attackers are benefiting from organizational indecision on cyber risk, including a lack of clarity on the danger and the failure to execute effective cyber controls. I think it's useful before we start just to consider what good looks like. What do we mean by good security outcomes? And for me, it's these. It's resilience to loss events. We can't avoid cyber breaches, but we can try to manage them within our tolerance for loss, and we certainly want to try and avoid cyber catastrophe. We need to make sure that we're using our resources effectively and efficiently, addressing the risks that could cause the greatest harm and in proportion to the level of those risks. We want to make sure that spending's optimized so that we're getting value for money for our spend on cybersecurity, particularly in the current crisis, and I expect for some time afterwards as well. We need to make sure that investment, or the need for investment, is understood, justified. We can see the return on investment from our cybersecurity investments. And we want to be able to make risk-informed strategic decisions around digitalization as we move forward. And overall, I think we're looking for confidence, certainly at executive level, that cyber risk is under control. McKinsey, the global management consultancy, released a report towards the end of 2019 identifying 3 states that they felt most organizations were in, and they're summarized on this slide here. First of all, down at the bottom left, a lack of capability and awareness throughout the organization, including senior leadership, obviously is a pretty poor situation to be in. The sorts of activities that organizations at this level are doing might be assessing cyber security maturity with or without benchmarks to identify gaps in security, perhaps also evaluating cyber awareness. The next stage is the maturity-based stage, which is focused on building capabilities, so plugging gaps in security by strengthening essential security and resilience fundamentals, establishing a cyber operating model and an organization. And example activities at this level might be building a security operations center and incident response playbooks, identity and access management functions being created, installing multi-factor authentication on applications, and creating and staffing a CISO office and connecting it to other parts of the business. McKinsey, however, apart from identifying that maturity-based approaches are the norm and focused on this building of capabilities, identified a number of problems. First of all, that maturity-based approaches stimulate unmanageable growth of control and oversight. For example, in monitoring, a maturity-based project tends to run rampant and aspires to monitor everything. And before long, the number of applications that are queued to be monitored outstrips the capability of analysts to monitor them, and the installation of monitoring bogs down application development teams. They also found that spending escalates. Controls grow year after year as planning requires more and more spend on controls, but is risk actually being reduced? Often the best ROI from security is in employee awareness and training, but the maturity-based approach just doesn't collect this data to allow us to decide whether funding should be diverted from, say, application monitoring. The final problem area is that it can result in paralysing implementation gridlock. There's a relatively small number of people with the hands-on implementation skills around cybersecurity, and they can quickly get overwhelmed if their time is spread too thinly, resulting often in program dashboards permanently stuck on amber. And McKinsey rather brutally summarised the maturity-based cybersecurity approach as a dog that's had its day, saying that in today's hyper-connected world, a more strategic risk-based approach is imperative. Fortunately, it's a journey, and the next stage in evolution is the risk-based approach. And the primary goal of the risk-based approach is in risk reduction. So it's around identifying, prioritizing, delivering, and managing the security and privacy controls that will reduce risk. It's aligning with the enterprise risk management framework and the business's tolerance for risk, and it includes all stakeholders across the enterprise in the cyber operating model. It allows prioritization of investments in cyber programs that will have the greatest impact on reducing risk. So, for example, taking the application monitoring example, whereas a maturity-based project would monitor everything, in practice, some applications represent greater vulnerability and potential for risk for others, and it's these where we need to focus our attention and work out the monitoring required for specific high-risk applications. The risk-based approach also aligns the board's risk reduction targets with cybersecurity programs and optimizes defenses for risk reduction, resilience, and cost, so that appropriate controls are applied to the worst vulnerabilities to defeat the most significant threats, which are those that are targeting the most critical processes and assets within our business. The risk-based approach focuses on critical assets to make sure that they're highly protected, but at less overall cost than maturity-based approaches. And quite typically, as we move to a risk-based approach, then this is where we start to see the involvement of cyber risk quantification, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the big difference between maturity-based and risk-based approaches is that the risk-based approach measures and reports on risk reduction as opposed to progress of capabilities. McKinsey also did a cost comparison. They note in the report that their costs are illustrative but extrapolated from real-world examples and estimates, and they compared the costs, typical costs, in a maturity-based approach compared to a risk-based approach. And they looked at costs for technology controls, information security processes, security organization, cyber risk management and governance. And they saw reduction in all areas, but substantial savings in relation to the cost of controls for non-key assets and around cyber risk management and governance. So They found that it's possible to reduce cost, but also apply high protection to the most critical assets. I think this is really important in the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. The pandemic is inevitably putting pressure on budgets, including cybersecurity, but McKinsey are showing here that a risk-based approach can not only increase and improve security in the most critical areas, but it can also reduce cost overall. So let's now go on to look at the risk-based approach. First thing I'd like to say is that cyber risk is continuous. It's an ongoing operational risk that changes over time. It doesn't go away. It's different to project type risks, which you open, manage, and then close. There are many factors that can influence cyber risk, and these change all the time. So again, cyber risk isn't really suited to once a year or occasional reviews. We need to get into a rhythm of more continuous review and management of cyber risk. To illustrate that, we achieve business outcomes through critical business processes which depend upon sensitive and critical information assets and other supporting assets. And those business outcomes are influenced by cyber risk. And there are a number of different factors that can influence our cyber risk. And above the line, these factors have the tendency to increase risk, and below it, they can reduce risk. So the red lines here, the T's, are representing threats. These are new threats that we might identify that come in of different levels. At some stage in the future, the threat might reduce. The green lines are representing vulnerabilities, critical exploitable vulnerabilities, which as they come in are going to increase our risk profile. Perhaps over time we'll mitigate some of those. The yellow bars are controls. So this could be a weakness found in an audit or a penetration test, which is indicating a higher level of risk, or we may take action at a later point to address that weakness or even to implement new cybersecurity products and services. The I's I put in here are incidents. These blue lines, they're not directly increasing risk, but they're shining a light on risk. And if we don't deal with the root causes, then we're going to continue to be at risk of these incidents occurring again. So overall, the effect of these different factors over time means that our risk profile changes. And if we set a tolerance for risk, then at certain times we're likely to be below or within our tolerance, and at other times we might be above our tolerance for risk. We can look at expenditure on cybersecurity in a similar way. We might set a budget, we might allow some tolerance for incidents, but over time, if we have significant incidents or if we have the same incident repeating itself, then we may find that our costs are going up above budget, particularly if we have to start to deal with reputational impacts and so on. If we have unbudgeted spend to deal with audit points or test results, or we decide to implement new solutions, then those are going to increase our costs as well. And similarly, as our costs increase and other impacts increase, then perhaps over time, then our business outcomes are going to drop below target as well. I think it's quite interesting here. There's a correlation or a relationship between budget and business outcomes, and I would argue that there's also a relationship between our risk going above tolerance and subsequent additional expenditure and reducing business outcomes. So I believe that going above our risk tolerance is quite a good leading indicator to future problems that we might see down the line. And just to give an example of that, of Equifax, Equifax had a very serious data breach in May 2017. The last report I saw estimated costs of about 1.4 billion for cleanup and security transformation. 2 years later, in 2019, Equifax reported a Q1 loss of 556 million compared to net income of 91 million in the corresponding period for the previous year. So there's a lag here between the serious breach and the business impact and outcome. Moving on and just drilling a little deeper, then our critical and sensitive information assets are dependent upon secondary assets, so people, processes, technology, third parties, and so on. But even by just focusing on critical and sensitive information assets, the situation is still quite complex. We may have the same cloud provider supporting multiple critical business processes. Multiple critical applications might be dependent upon the same server. We'll have dependencies across the supply chain and interdependencies, and the situation changes all the time. New business processes might be introduced. We might collect more sensitive data as we digitalise. We're forever introducing new technologies. We're reorganising. We might have M&A activity and so on. So we need to understand and get our arms around these criticalities and dependencies. Most of the threats, vulnerabilities, controls and incidents that occur apply to our secondary assets. So criminals target home workers with phishing campaigns, and we direct our awareness campaigns at employees. Vulnerabilities on servers are identified and hopefully patched, but if not, hackers will target those unpatched servers. Many organizations have been breached via their supply chains. So we need to understand not just the critical information assets and applications, but also the dependencies and the various risk factors relating to each of them. But there's no doubt that it's a big step forward if we can get visibility of how risk factors change over time in relation to our critical processes, assets, and so on. But how do we make risk-based decisions? What should we do to reduce risk? Well, the key levers that we have to reduce risk are to implement or to improve controls. In their broadest sense, this is. So this could include encrypting sensitive data or improving access control, but also patching vulnerabilities, key vulnerabilities more quickly, developing and testing good incident response plans, building resilience into critical business processes, and so on. But these all cost money. So how do we decide and prioritize on our activity? And the answer to that is that we need to measure risk. And in particular, we need to understand how risk reacts to controls. So taking this example, perhaps these incidents are incidents of data leakage, and we're considering down here a control of enterprise data loss prevention to address the data leakage incidents that we've been having and risks associated with that. So if we do it, we might expect there's some sort of reduction in risk, and there will be a cost that we need to pay to deploy that DLP solution. So we need to balance both the risk benefit that we might achieve from implementing the DLP solution with the cost of actually doing so. And by doing that, then we have the information on which to make a balanced risk-based decision on whether or not there's a good ROI from deploying enterprise DLP. This really requires us to measure risk in financial terms so we can make a comparison against the cost of deploying the control. And so we're now starting to move into quantitative type approaches to measuring cyber risk. One other point that's important for us to be aware of is that there's uncertainty in risk by its very definition. So if we're talking about data leakage, for example, then how much might we potentially lose from a data leakage incident or series of incidents? Could it be 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, and so on? So there's uncertainty in that information. There's also uncertainty in the level of threat, how exploitable the vulnerabilities are, the strength and effectiveness of controls. And all of this means that there is uncertainty in our risk profile as well. But there are techniques that we can use, Monte Carlo analysis, for example, if we're using a quantitative risk assessment that can handle these sorts of uncertainties extremely well. And just as an example of that, this is an example of the sort of output and reporting that we can get if we use quantitative risk assessment techniques for cybersecurity. This is a loss exceedance curve, and we can see here our existing risk profile is the black line, and currently we're saying that we have a 40% chance of losing more than $10 million in the next 12 months. Proposals being put forward to implement an enterprise DLP at a cost of $500,000 a year within Europe. And we can model the effect of that. And this is actually bringing the risk profile down to the blue line here. And the probability of losing $10 million we're forecasting is going to reduce down to less than 5%. So the question that this is then posing is, should we spend $500,000 a year on enterprise DLP to reduce the risk of losing $10 million in the next year from 40% to less than 5%? And I think this is a very good, mature question to be discussing with budget holders and with executives in organizations. It's based on numbers, it's reflecting uncertainty, and it's still reflecting the fact that there'll be some residual risk at the end of this. There's still a 5% or less than 5% chance that we could lose $10 million in the next year. So this is a mature conversation that we can have as an example of a risk-based discussion around ROI for deploying new controls. Just incidentally, before I move on, this dotted line is management's tolerance for risk. So again, we can see where we sit compared to management's tolerance for risk. And this green line is an estimate of the level of risk that we can potentially reduce down to if all of the controls within our portfolio were operating at full strength and were fully effective. So let's draw things together now, and I'd like to introduce what we see as 7 important steps towards a risk-based approach. And the first thing that I would start with is setting the right scope. So we need to identify our critical value-producing business processes, the critical and sensitive information assets that support those, and the dependencies on secondary assets and their interrelationships. I would suggest that we start with the main risks of concern. So a number of our customers now are using triage to fairly quickly identify the major risks and start with these and then work down into a bit more detail. The second step then is to capture and correlate relevant risk information. So we saw from the timeline that there are many factors influencing risk, and we need to get visibility in relation to our critical business processes or assets. We need to understand which threats apply to them, which controls are mitigating those threats. If we've got critical exploitable vulnerabilities on servers that are being used by those critical applications, then we need to deal with them. We also need to understand what's happening in practice. So test results from penetration tests or incident response tests, for example, data from incidents and near misses themselves, issues, audit findings, all of this information shines a light on our current risk status. And then finally, actions that have been identified to address perhaps audit findings, to remediate vulnerabilities, to deal with the outcome of tests and so on. Until these actions are complete, have been tested and shown to work, we're still at risk. And so where we have overdue actions, then that's an indication that we're still at risk. But if we have this sort of visibility, and within a lot of organizations, you'll find, I think, that this data is in multiple different places. So this second step really is involved with bringing it all together. It's centralizing it, it's correlating it with each other, so that you can start to get insights such as, for critical assets, what are the critical open vulnerabilities? What are the outstanding audit points? What incidents and near misses have we had? Are there any overdue actions? And what does that mean in terms of risk for our critical business processes? Or we flip it over and we look at an overdue action and we say, well, what assets and critical business processes are at risk because we're not able to complete and close off this action? Do we have any incidents that are occurring because of this delay in completing the action, and so on? Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3 is about making risk-informed decisions. So once we have visibility of the data and the interrelationships, we can start to analyze and make risk-informed decisions along the lines of, is the risk to critical assets within our tolerance or acceptable? If we have limited budget, which key controls should we focus on now? Can we justify investment in new controls? The DLP example that we've just been talking about. Or if we have to cut budget, where would it cause the least harm? So to support decision making, we must measure risk and understand the effect of risk on controls. And that means we ideally need to quantify risk in financial terms and understand how it reacts and relates to controls. And this will be the subject of our next webinar. And we'll do a deep dive into quantitative risk assessment and how that can be incorporated into the risk-based approach in the next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. Just illustrating there an example of a heat map for triaging our critical risks. Step 4 then is reporting in the language of business leaders. So this needs to be consistent and aligned with other material business risks. In my experience, business leaders want to understand what are the top 10 risks, what's going to be done about them, and by when, who's responsible, and they want to be updated at the next meeting, and so on. But we need to have those conversations around what good looks like, the good security outcomes. So around what it means for the resilience of the business, what it means in terms of value for money or return on investment. And I think a key point is that we need to have the underlying data and analytics in order to be able to report in the language of business leaders. So we need steps 1, 2, and 3 in order to be able to deliver on step 4 and report in the language of business leaders. Step 5 then is maintaining evidence and history. If we have a data breach, and particularly if we lose personal data, then it's quite possible that the regulator will investigate and want to know whether we'd identified the risk, what decisions have been taken, what controls were in place at the time of the breach. And so we need to be able to maintain that evidence and that history. We talked about Equifax earlier and the serious data breach they had. In the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office fined Equifax the maximum £500,000. It was before GDPR took effect, so it was in relation to the old data protection legislation. Clearly, the fine would have been much more, I think, under GDPR. But the report from the ICO was that Equifax failed to undertake adequate risk assessments, and where the risks were identified, failed to address these sufficiently, promptly, and effectively. And then there were a range of other issues that were highlighted in relation to that breach. So not adequately encrypting personal data, failing to address known vulnerabilities, not having fully up-to-date software, and so on. And I won't go through all of these, but all of these were potential up arrows on our risk timeline. All of these were potential early warning signs and indicators that risk was increasing, and who knows, if Equifax had identified that risk and had tracked this data, this would have risen up and been addressed before that significant breach actually occurred. The regulators publish information on pretty much all of the breaches that they investigate, and I would say without fail, they almost always refer to a failure to undertake adequate risk assessment and then to address the findings of risk assessments effectively. So we really need to capture our history and evidence to show that we've identified the risk, we'd assessed the risk diligently, and we know which controls we had in place at that particular point. We know that we can never guarantee security. It's a risk-based decision, but if we can show that we were diligent, we can then mitigate fines and potentially even avoid fines, including the potential reputational damage that comes with it. The step 6 then is accepting accountability. Since we can't avoid risk, we'll find ourselves needing to accept risk, and that means making trade-offs usually. So trading off business benefits against the rights and freedoms of individuals, potentially being a little bit less secure at the expense of user experience, trading off cost versus benefit, and all of these are important decisions that we'll need to make as we digitalize going forward. The ability to accept risk increases with seniority, so the highest risks need to be accepted by business leaders based on the full visibility of risk information. And then those accepting risk need to accept accountability for their decisions and be prepared to respond in the event that that risk actually materializes. And then the final step is to monitor and continually improve. So we can assess, we can measure, we can accept risk from time to time, we can capture our evidence, it's almost immediately out of date, control performance deteriorates, new vulnerabilities come along, new threat intelligence might become apparent, incidents occur, all of which throw new light on our understanding of risk. But over time, then we'll learn and we'll improve in our ability to understand and to manage risk, taking the risk-based approach. Just to summarize, the maturity approach, which is where, according to McKinsey, most organizations are, is focused on building capability, and it has these problems of unmanageable growth, escalating spending, and implementation gridlock. The risk-based approach, on the other hand, focuses and prioritizes on risk reduction, aligns cybersecurity programs with the board's risk reduction targets, optimizes defense for risk reduction, resilience, and cost, and manages to protect critical asset more effectively at a lower overall cost. And finally, my conclusions. Maturity-based approaches to cybersecurity are unsuitable for mature organizations. The risk-based approach aligns with the board's requirements to understand and reduce cyber risk and to improve efficiency and to reduce costs. We recommend that you apply the 7 steps that we've discussed here, and by doing that you'll be able to use the outputs to reduce enterprise risk, optimize cybersecurity investments, and provide operational resilience. I recommend the McKinsey paper. There have been a couple that have been published. This one was, I think, from October 2019 on the risk-based approach. I suggest you have a look at that. If you'd like to learn more about putting it into practice, making it work, then please do come and talk to Acuity. A couple of other resources I'd like to mention: the white paper on the risk-based approach to cybersecurity and the 7 steps, and a 1-page infographic. You're welcome to download these. Further information is available from us. Please do contact us. Go to the website if you'd like to request a demonstration of our Stream Cyber Risk Management platform. There are other white papers on the website, historical webinars. Please think about following us on social media as well. And then just to recap, the next 2 webinars in 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about quantifying your cyber risk and delving into everything that's involved in quantification of cyber risk. And then we'll be talking about bringing everything together and reporting to the board 2 weeks after that, on the 2nd of June. So thanks very much for listening. I'm conscious that I've gone slightly over time. I'm just going to look to see if there's any questions here. Okay, I can see there are just 2 questions actually, so I'll just deal with those. First of all, is risk quantification essential for the risk-based approach? I would say it's important. Yes, it's not essential right now, and there's a journey, I think, for most organizations to move towards a quantitative approach, and it's possible to migrate from a qualitative to a quantitative. And what I mean by qualitative approach is sort of using ordinal scales such as very low to very high for impact and likelihood. It's useful for triage and for prioritizing at a high level our risks, but the qualitative approach can't aggregate risk, can't handle uncertainty, and it can't easily compare risks against cost or report on ROI. And then just one final question, what do I mean by risk triage? It's about quickly identifying critical assets and high risks so that we can focus our attention there first. So we have some customers that use sets of questions to identify critical applications, questions around sensitivity, criticality of data, that sort of thing, number of users, types of technology and access that's being used, that sort of thing, and also the high level sort of qualitative type risk assessment to do a quick high level triage type assessment. Okay, I hope that's been helpful. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through at the moment. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for attending. Please contact us. We'd love to continue the conversation with you, and very much hope to see you at the next webinar in 2 weeks' time from now.